What's the strangest rule your family had that made no sense until you learned the real reason? Growing up, we had one absolute rule that made zero sense. No one was allowed to answer the door after 6 p.m. ever. My mom would physically block us if we even moved toward the door when someone knocked. Dad installed a special deadbolt that required a key from the inside. When my friends came over for sleepovers, they thought my parents were paranoid freaks. What if it's an emergency? I'd ask. Then they'll call 911, Mom would say, her voice shaking like she'd seen a ghost. The rule was so strict that when my aunt collapsed on our front porch during a family barbecue at 7 p.m., we watched through the window as she convulsed on our welcome mat. Mom dialed 911 but wouldn't unlock the door until the paramedics arrived. My aunt survived, but she never spoke to us again. At family gatherings, she'd stare at my parents with this look of pure disgust. I was 12 when I started questioning everything. Why did we move every 2 years like clockwork? Why did Mom flinch whenever someone mentioned our last name at school events? Why did Dad have 3 different driver's licenses hidden in his toolbox that I found while looking for a screwdriver? Why did we never visit relatives or have any family photos displayed anywhere in the house? The worst part was watching my younger brother Ethan accept it all as normal. He'd tell kids at school that our family had a door disease that made us allergic to nighttime visitors. When teachers called home asking about his strange explanations, Mom would hang up and we'd start packing again. Every move followed the same pattern. Dad would come home from work early, looking pale and checking his phone obsessively. Mom would start crying and pulling our emergency suitcases from the closet. We'd leave everything behind except clothes and a small box of documents that Dad guarded like his life depended on it. Where are we going this time? I'd ask. Somewhere safe was always the answer. But safe from what? That's what I could never figure out. When I turned 16, I decided I'd had enough. My boyfriend Wesley was picking me up for prom at 7:30 p.m., and I told my parents he was coming whether they liked it or not. I was tired of being the weird girl who couldn't have normal teenage experiences because of some mysterious family paranoia. Mom went completely pale when I told her. Cassidy, you don't understand what you're risking. Then explain it to me, I demanded, crossing my arms. I'm 16 years old, and I deserve to know why we live like prisoners. Dad looked at Mom with this expression I'd never seen before, like they were having an entire conversation with just their eyes. Finally, he sank into his chair and poured himself a whiskey, something I'd never seen him do in my entire life. Sit down, he said quietly. Both of you. Ethan joined us at the kitchen table, sensing something big was about to happen. Dad's hands were actually trembling as he took a sip of his drink. Your real name isn't Cassidy Morgan, he said so quietly I almost didn't hear him. It's Cassidy Volkov, and your grandfather isn't dead like we told you. He's in federal prison. My stomach dropped to the floor. What are you talking about? Mom joined us, tears already streaming down her face. Your father's family controlled the heroin trade on the East Coast for 30 years. When your dad testified against them, we had to disappear. The room started spinning. I felt like I was going to throw up. Testified against who? My own father, Dad whispered, staring into his glass. My brothers, my uncles, my cousins, everyone I'd ever called family. He explained how he'd been born into the Volkov crime family in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, how he'd been laundering money through legitimate businesses since he was 18 years old, thinking it was just smart business practice, how his father had groomed him to take over the financial side of the operation, sending him to college to study accounting and finance with money earned from drug dealing and human trafficking. I thought we were entrepreneurs, Dad said, his voice breaking slightly. Your grandfather always told me we were just smarter than other people, that we saw opportunities where others saw problems. He made it sound like we were helping the community, providing services that people needed. I didn't realize what we really were until it was too late. The family business had started in the 1960s when my great-grandfather immigrated from Russia with connections to organized crime back home. What began as small-time protection rackets had evolved into a sophisticated operation that controlled everything from dock workers' unions to high-end restaurants in Manhattan. By the time I was old enough to understand what was really happening, I was already in too deep, Dad continued. They had files on me, evidence of my involvement in money laundering that could have put me away for 20 years. But more than that, they were family. You don't just walk away from family. The turning point had come when his nephew, my cousin Alexei, overdosed on the family's own heroin when he was only 14 years old. Dad had found the body in a crack house that his own money had helped establish, surrounded by other kids from the neighborhood who were slowly destroying their lives with products the Volkov family imported and distributed. That's when I realized what we really were, Dad continued, his voice getting stronger as he talked. Not businessmen, not entrepreneurs. We were poisoning our own community, destroying families, creating the very addicts who were buying our product and then profiting from their desperation. I couldn't live with it anymore. But leaving wasn't simple. The family had protocols for dealing with members who wanted out, and those protocols usually involved a funeral. I tried to distance myself gradually, Dad said. Started making mistakes with the books, acted like I was burning out, hoped they'd just reassign me to something harmless. But your grandfather saw right through it. One night, they'd brought Dad to a warehouse in Queens where they'd tied a man to a chair. The man was a mid-level dealer who'd been skimming money and thinking about going to the police. They wanted me to kill him, Dad said, his voice barely audible, to prove my loyalty, to show that I was still family. Dad had refused, and that's when they knew for certain that he was a liability. That's when I contacted the FBI, he said. I had no choice. It was either help them build a case or end up like that man in the warehouse. For 2 years, Dad had worn a wire to family meetings, recorded conversations in restaurants and social clubs, and documented financial transactions that moved millions of dollars through shell companies and offshore accounts. He'd photographed documents, memorized shipping schedules, and gathered evidence of murders, kidnappings, and corruption that went all the way up to judges and city council members. The hardest part wasn't the danger, Dad said. It was looking my own father in the eye every Sunday at dinner, knowing I was building the case that would destroy everything he'd spent his life creating. The night before Dad was supposed to testify, 3 men had come to our old house in Brooklyn. Mom was 8 months pregnant with me, and they'd been planning to flee to a safe house the next morning. I was in the kitchen making borscht, Mom said, taking over the story. Your dad's favorite meal. I thought it might be his last home-cooked dinner for a while, depending on how the trial went and how long we'd have to stay in protective custody. When she heard the knock at exactly 8 p.m., something felt wrong. Usually, Dad's family just walked in without knocking. They had keys to each other's houses and treated them like communal property. The knock was too polite, too patient, Mom continued, and there was something about the rhythm of it. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It was like a code. Dad had come downstairs and looked through the peephole. He recognized his cousin Dimitri and 2 enforcers from the family, men whose primary job was collecting debts and eliminating problems permanently. If I had opened that door, Dad said, they would have executed our entire family, shot us right there in our living room, probably made it look like a home invasion gone wrong. The neighbors would have found our bodies in the morning. Instead, they'd called 911 and hidden in the basement safe room Dad had built when he first started cooperating with the FBI. The men had disappeared before the cops showed up, but they'd left a message spray-painted on the garage door in bright red letters. Rats die slowly. That's why we can never answer the door after dark, Mom explained. Because that's when they come hunting. They've been hunting us for 16 years and they'll never stop. I sat there in shock, trying to process everything. My entire life had been a lie. Every friend I'd lost when we moved. Every relationship I'd been too scared to develop because I knew we'd leave anyway. Every normal teenage experience I'd missed. It was all because of choices my father had made before I was even born. But as the initial shock wore off, I started to understand the impossible position he'd been in. Stay loyal to his family and become complicit in murder and drug dealing, or betray them and spend the rest of his life running. But that was 16 years ago. I finally managed to say. Surely they've moved on by now. Found other people to blame. Dad and Mom exchanged another one of those loaded looks that married couples develop after years of shared secrets. Your Uncle Bruno was released from federal prison last month, Dad said quietly. We got word through our handler 3 days ago. He's been asking questions about us in the old neighborhood, offering money for information. My blood turned to ice. Our handler? We're in the Federal Witness Protection Program, Mom said. Have been since you were 6 months old. Everything you know about our life, our names, our history, our identities, it's all been carefully constructed to keep us hidden. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only was my family history a lie, but I wasn't even who I thought I was. What's my real name? I asked. Cassidy Volkov, Dad said. Named after your great-grandmother, who was reportedly the only person my grandfather ever truly feared. Suddenly, everything made sense. The way Mom would scan crowds at the grocery store like she was looking for specific faces. How Dad always parked facing the exit wherever we went. And how he taught us to identify at least 2 escape routes from any building we entered. Why we had no family photos, no yearbooks, no connections to the past. Why we moved constantly but never seemed to have financial problems despite Dad's seemingly ordinary jobs. The house we lived in when you were little? Dad continued. The one with the swing set in the backyard that you barely remember? That wasn't our first relocation. It was our 4th. They found us in Phoenix when you were 2, then Dallas when you were 4, then Minneapolis when you were 6. Each time, we barely escaped with our lives. Each discovery had been different, but the pattern was always the same. Someone would recognize Dad at a store or restaurant. A teacher would ask too many questions about our family history. A neighbor would notice Dad's habit of checking cars for tracking devices. How did they find us? Ethan asked, speaking for the first time since this conversation had started. Different ways each time, Mom said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Sometimes they'd recognize your father's face even though he'd grown a beard or dyed his hair. Once, they traced a Christmas card your dad's sister sent before she understood the gravity of the situation. Another time, they hacked into school records looking for children with our birthdays and physical descriptions. In Dallas, they'd found us because Dad had used his real social security number when applying for a job. In Minneapolis, it was because Ethan had mentioned in school that his father knew how to speak Russian, which got back to a teacher whose brother worked for a private investigator. Every time we thought we were safe, Dad said. Every time we thought maybe they'd given up, or maybe we'd finally gotten far enough away. But they never stopped looking. Your grandfather put a price on my head that's still active. $500,000 to anyone who can deliver me alive to the family. What about dead? I asked, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. $250,000, Dad replied without hesitation. They want me to suffer before I die. They want to make an example of what happens to people who betray the family. The money wasn't even the main motivation anymore, Dad explained. It was about reputation and respect. In their world, letting a betrayal go unpunished was seen as weakness. And weakness was fatal to a criminal organization. Every few years, someone new takes over leadership and decides they need to prove themselves, Dad said. And hunting down the rat who destroyed the family's East Coast operation is seen as a prestigious assignment. So when Wesley comes to pick me up tonight, I started. You're not going, Dad said firmly. We're leaving. Tonight. Our handler is already arranging emergency transportation to a new location. Something in me snapped. After 16 years of running, of living in constant fear, of never being able to form lasting relationships or feel truly safe anywhere, I was finally old enough to understand what we'd lost. what I'd never had the chance to experience. Normal family relationships, grandparents who could spoil us and tell us embarrassing stories about our parents, aunts and uncles who sent birthday cards and remembered our achievements, friends we could keep for more than 2 years, the ability to plant roots somewhere and watch them grow. No, I said, standing up from the table. I'm not running anymore. I didn't choose this life. I didn't make the decisions that put us here. I'm not going to keep paying the price for something I had no part in. You don't have a choice, Mom pleaded, reaching for my hand. If they find us, if they find you, then we call the police. This is America, not some lawless wasteland. We have rights. We have protection under the law. Dad laughed, but there was no humor in it. The police? Honey, half the cops in our old precinct were on my family's payroll. 3 judges too, and at least 1 prosecutor. You think corruption stays in one city? You think they don't have reach wherever we go? But the FBI can protect us while we're actively testifying and while there's an ongoing case, Dad explained. But the witness protection program doesn't last forever. Eventually, you're supposed to build a new life and disappear into it completely. We've never been able to do that because they keep finding us. Maybe it's time to stop running, I said. Maybe it's time to fight back. With what? Mom asked desperately. We're 4 people against an entire criminal organization that has resources, connections, and motivation we can't even comprehend. We have the truth, I said. We have evidence. We have 16 years of documentation about how they've been harassing us. That has to count for something. Dad shook his head. The evidence that put them away originally is what's keeping us alive right now. They can't just make us disappear without consequences because the FBI knows their history with us. But if we surface, if we try to live normal lives, we become easy targets again. Then what's the point? I asked, my voice rising. What's the point of being alive if we're not really living? What's the point of surviving if we can never actually have a life? The question hung in the air like smoke. None of us had an answer. That night, as I sat in my room staring at my prom dress hanging in the closet, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to prom, and whatever happened afterward, we'd face it as a family. At 7:30 p.m. exactly, I heard Wesley's car pull up outside. He knocked on the front door, probably holding the corsage he'd saved up 3 months to buy me. I could picture him out there in his rented tuxedo, nervous but excited about our first formal dance together. My parents went into immediate crisis mode. Dad grabbed the loaded handgun he kept in the kitchen drawer, something else I just learned about my family. Mom pushed Ethan toward the hallway closet where there was a hidden panic room Dad had built into every house we'd ever lived in. Don't answer it, Dad hissed, positioning himself where he could see both the front door and the back entrance. But I was done being afraid, done living like a prisoner in my own life. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. Wesley stood there in his rented tuxedo, looking nervous but excited. The corsage was exactly the right color to match my dress, baby blue with white roses. He'd probably spent an hour at the florist making sure it was perfect. Behind him, partially hidden by our neighbor's hedge, stood a man in a dark suit, watching, waiting. My blood turned to ice. Dad, I whispered, there's someone else out there? He joined me at the peephole, his gun drawn and ready. When he saw the man in the suit, all color drained from his face. That's Dimitri, he breathed. My cousin. Wesley knocked again, calling my name. He had no idea he was being used as bait, that his presence had probably signed his death warrant just by being associated with me. Cassidy? Wesley called through the door. I know you're in there. Your mom's car is in the driveway. Dad was already on his phone with our federal marshal. They found us. We need immediate extraction. But it was too late. As we watched through various windows throughout the house, more men emerged from cars parked strategically around our neighborhood. 6 of them total, surrounding our house like we were the targets of a military operation. The basement, Dad ordered. Now. We had a reinforced safe room down there, steel-lined walls, separate ventilation system, satellite phone, enough food and water for 3 days. I'd always thought it was Dad's paranoid overkill. Now I realized it might be the only thing standing between us and execution. As we huddled in the basement, I could hear Wesley still knocking, then calling my name louder. His voice changed as he realized something was wrong. Cassidy? If you're in there, just let me know you're okay, he called. I'm worried about you. Then I heard other voices, men speaking quietly but urgently. Wesley's voice changed again, confusion, then fear. Hey, what are you doing? Get away from me, he said. I don't know what you want, but his voice was cut off abruptly. I heard what sounded like a struggle, then car doors slamming, an engine revved, tires screeched against asphalt, then silence. 20 minutes later, our marshal called back on the satellite phone. They're gone, but they left a message. What message? Dad asked, his voice hoarse with fear. They took the boy. My heart stopped beating. Wesley? Mom grabbed my arm so tightly it left bruises. They have your boyfriend. The marshal explained the situation over the satellite phone. The Volkov family had been tracking us for months, probably since Bruno's release was first approved by the parole board. They'd done extensive research into my life, my routines, my relationships. They knew exactly how to hurt us most effectively. They want to meet, the marshal said. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m., the old warehouse district on the south side of town. Absolutely not, Dad said immediately. It's obviously a trap. It's not a request. They sent a video to our field office. The boy is alive but injured. If you don't show up, they'll kill him and upload the execution to every social media platform they can find. They want to make an example. I stared at my parents. These strangers who'd built their entire lives around a lie, who'd dragged me and Ethan into a nightmare we'd never asked for. I'm going, I said. You're not going anywhere, Dad snapped. He's there because of me, because of us, because of choices you made before I was even born. I won't let him die for sins I didn't commit. Mom was crying harder now. If you go, they'll kill you both. They'll torture you first, then make examples of you to send a message to anyone else who might think about betraying the family. Maybe But if I don't go, they'll definitely kill him, and then they'll just hunt us somewhere else, and someone else will get hurt. How many innocent people have to suffer because we keep running instead of facing this? Dad tried a different approach. Even if we could somehow rescue Wesley, it won't end there. They'll never stop hunting us. This isn't a problem we can solve by being brave or doing the right thing. Then maybe it's time to solve it permanently, I said. The next day, I spent hours researching everything I could find about the Volkov family online. News articles about the original trial, court documents that were public record, information about their business operations and known associates. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The family had been decimated by Dad's testimony 16 years ago, but they'd been rebuilding. Bruno and 3 of his brothers had received life sentences. Their father, my grandfather, had died in prison 5 years ago from a heart attack. Most of their legitimate businesses had been seized by the federal government, but they'd adapted. Smaller, more careful, more vicious. Bruno's son Mikhail had taken over operations while his father was in prison, focusing on human trafficking and cybercrime rather than traditional drug dealing. They had connections to Russian organized crime, Eastern European arms dealers, and corrupt officials in at least 6 countries. They're not just looking for revenge, I told my parents that evening. They're looking to rebuild their reputation. Killing the rat who destroyed their family would send a message to every law enforcement agency and potential witness in the country. All the more reason not to walk into their trap, Dad said. All the more reason to end this once and for all, I replied. Against every protocol and my parents' desperate pleas, I walked into that warehouse district the next evening. Dad came with me, his service weapon drawn but essentially useless against the 8 armed men waiting inside the abandoned building. The warehouse smelled like rust and old motor oil. Broken windows let in shafts of orange light from the setting sun, creating long shadows across the concrete floor. Wesley was tied to a metal chair in the center of the space, his face bloodied but his eyes alert. When he saw me, relief flooded his features. Cassidy? Thank God you're okay. What's going on? These men said you owed them money, but I told them you're just a high school student. Your family doesn't have that kind of... Hello, cousin, a voice said from the shadows. Uncle Bruno stepped into the light cast by portable floodlights they'd set up around the perimeter. He looked exactly like Dad, but 20 pounds heavier, with colder eyes and fresh prison tattoos covering his forearms. His hair was completely gray now, and there was a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, probably from a prison fight. You've grown up beautiful, he said to me, his voice carrying a slight Russian accent that Dad had worked hard to eliminate from his own speech. You look just like your grandmother did at your age. She would have been proud to see what a strong young woman you've become. Let him go, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This is between family. Bruno laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Family? Your father destroyed our family, cost us everything we'd built over 3 generations, sent my brothers to die in federal prison while he lived comfortably under government protection. You think there's no price for that? The price was 16 years of your life in federal prison, Dad said, his gun trained on Bruno but surrounded by too many other weapons to make any difference. We're even. Even? Bruno's voice turned deadly quiet. I lost my businesses, my house. My wife divorced me while I was inside and took everything I had left. My son had to rebuild our entire operation from nothing while I rotted in a cell with rapists and murderers. My daughter won't even visit me because she's ashamed of the family name. You think 16 years makes us even? He pulled out a chrome-plated pistol and pointed it directly at Wesley's head. Here's what's going to happen. Your daughter is going to work for me. Clean money, handle books, manage legitimate fronts, just like you used to do before you decided to become a rat. Consider it the family business coming full circle. I'd rather die, I said without hesitation. That can be arranged. But the boy dies first, then your little brother, then your mother. You'll watch it all before we put you out of your misery. Dad stepped forward, lowering his own weapon in a gesture of surrender. Take me instead. I'm the one who betrayed you. I'm the one who chose to testify. Leave them out of it. You? Bruno spat. You're nothing to me anymore. A used-up rat who'll never be trusted by anyone ever again. But her, she's the future. She's young, smart, educated, and completely clean. Perfect for what I need to rebuild our operations. What operations? I asked. From what I read, the family business is finished. Bruno smiled coldly. You read wrong. We've been rebuilding for 10 years. Smaller, smarter, more international. Your boyfriend here is going to be our first demonstration of our new capabilities. He gestured to one of his men, who pulled out a tablet and showed it to us. On the screen was a live video feed of what looked like a shipping container. We have a very profitable human trafficking operation now, Bruno continued. Girls from Eastern Europe sold to wealthy Americans who prefer their entertainment young and disposable. Your boyfriend is going to help us test our newest shipment. My stomach turned. Wesley's face went white. You're sick, Dad said. I'm a businessman, Bruno replied. And you're going to help me expand into new markets, or this boy dies very slowly and very publicly. That's when Wesley did something incredibly stupid and incredibly brave. He'd been working on the ropes binding his hands while we talked, using the rough edge of the metal chair to fray them. In one motion, he threw himself in the chair sideways, knocking over a stack of wooden crates and shouting, "Run!" In the chaos that followed, everything happened at once. Dad tackled Bruno. I grabbed a crowbar from a pile of construction equipment and swung it at the nearest gunman. Ethan, who had followed us despite being ordered to stay with our marshal, threw a rock that shattered one of the floodlights. Gunshots rang out. Someone screamed. The remaining floodlight created wild, swinging shadows as men fought in the darkness. I heard Wesley yell in pain. Dad cursed loudly. Glass shattered somewhere in the darkness. When the chaos finally ended, Bruno was on the ground, shot twice by his own man in the confusion. Dad was wounded in the shoulder but alive and conscious. 3 of Bruno's men were down. 1 dead, 2 unconscious. The rest had fled when they heard police sirens approaching. Wesley was unconscious from hitting his head when he'd thrown himself over, but he was breathing steadily. Blood was coming from a cut on his forehead, but it didn't look life-threatening. But our victory was short-lived. As the paramedics worked on Dad's shoulder wound and the police took our statements, Detective Morrison pulled me aside. "We intercepted communications before the raid," he said quietly. "This wasn't the entire organization. Bruno's son Mikhail is already mobilizing resources to finish what his father started." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they're going to escalate. No more games, no more psychological warfare. They're going to keep coming until either they're all dead or you are." He showed me a transcript of a phone call they'd intercepted between Mikhail and someone in Russia. The old man failed because he got emotional, Mikhail had said in the call, made it personal instead of business. I won't make the same mistake. 6 months later, we were back in federal court. This time, the case was massive. A joint task force involving the FBI, DEA, and Interpol had been tracking the reformed Volkov organization across multiple countries for 2 years. The evidence we'd helped gather, combined with intelligence from Bruno's captured men and seized computers, led to the arrest of 47 people across 8 states and 3 countries. The operations they'd uncovered included not just human trafficking, but also cybercrime, arms dealing, and a sophisticated money laundering network that moved over $200 million annually. The judge personally thanked us for our cooperation and arranged for new identities and relocation to a place where the family's influence had never reached. But testifying again meant starting over completely. New names, new backgrounds, new lives constructed from nothing. Everything we'd built in our current location, friends, jobs, community connections, had to be abandoned. Wesley recovered from his concussion, and surprisingly, asked to stay with us through the transition. The federal marshals were initially reluctant. Adding another person to our protection detail complicated everything. But Wesley had been so thoroughly documented as part of our case that leaving him behind would have put him in danger anyway. Besides, he told me while we waited in a safe house for our new identities to be processed, after what we've been through, normal teenage problems seem pretty trivial. I've never felt more alive than during those terrible few days when everything was on the line. At least now I know who I really am, and I know what you mean to me. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in rural Montana where we spent 3 months while the marshals worked out the details of our new lives. It was the longest we'd stayed in one place since I was a child, and despite the circumstances, it felt almost normal. Wesley and I spent hours talking about everything. His childhood, mine, what we wanted to do with our lives once we were finally safe. He'd always wanted to study computer science, but now he was interested in cybersecurity, specifically helping law enforcement track down criminals who use technology to hurt people. "I want to make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to other families," he said. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed to be processing the trauma differently. He'd become quieter, more introspective. He spent hours reading about criminal justice and social work, talking about wanting to help other kids who'd been caught up in situations beyond their control. "We're not the only family dealing with this," he said one evening. "There are probably hundreds of kids out there living fake lives because their parents made enemies of dangerous people." He was right. During our debriefing sessions, we learned about other families in similar situations. Witnesses, former gang members, people who'd escaped human trafficking operations. The witness protection program was much larger than I'd ever imagined. "The hardest part isn't the danger," one of the marshals told us. "It's the isolation. Most families struggle with the complete loss of their previous identity. Some people never adjust. But we were adjusting, slowly. Mom started talking about maybe going back to school to become a teacher, something she'd always wanted to do, but had never had the stability to pursue. Dad was interested in working with victim advocacy groups, using his experience to help other people navigate the legal system. "Maybe some good can come out of all this," he said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset over the Montana mountains. "We're living under the name Chen now, in a small coastal town in Oregon, where the most dangerous thing that happens is when the high school football team wins the state championship and everyone honks their horns too enthusiastically while driving home from the game. Dad works as a bookkeeper for a small fishing company owned by a man who knows our full story and doesn't care. Mom teaches elementary school art classes and has become something of a local celebrity for her innovative techniques. I'm studying criminal justice in college, not to follow in the family business, but to understand how systems fail and how innocent people get caught in the crossfire of other people's choices." Wesley started a small business doing computer repair and web design for local businesses. He says he likes the irony of making an honest living with technology, considering how much digital surveillance and tracking we've been subjected to over the years. He's also been helping the local police department upgrade their computer systems, which gives him a sense of contributing to something positive. Ethan, now 20, jokes that our family's greatest criminal activity these days is returning library books late and occasionally jaywalking when we're running errands downtown. He's studying social work at the community college and planning to transfer to a 4-year university to complete his degree. He wants to specialize in helping families who've been displaced by violence and trauma. We still don't answer the door after dark, though. Some habits die hard, and some lessons are written too deep in your bones to ever completely fade. But now it's usually just because we're watching Netflix in our pajamas by 8 p.m., and unexpected visitors are inconvenient rather than potentially deadly. The marshals check in with us every few months, but the communication is becoming less frequent. The reformed Volkov organization was effectively destroyed by the international task force. Mikhail died in a shootout with Interpol agents in Romania. The few remaining family members are either in prison serving life sentences or have abandoned the criminal life entirely. "You're probably safe now," our last handler told us during his final visit. "But keep the protocols active for at least another 5 years. Old habits and old enemies sometimes resurface when you least expect them. The transition to normal life hasn't been easy. Wesley still has nightmares about the warehouse. Ethan sometimes flinches when he hears unexpected noises. Mom and Dad both struggle with anxiety, especially in crowded places where they feel like they can't control their environment. But we're building something real here, something stable. For the first time in my life, I'm making plans that extend beyond the next 2 years. Wesley and I are talking about getting married after I graduate from college. Ethan has made friends who know him well enough to tease him about his weird family quirks without knowing the full story behind them. It's strange, Mom said to me last week as we planted flowers in our front yard. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to recognize us or for a phone call telling us we have to run again. Maybe that's normal, I said. Maybe it takes time to trust that the danger is really over. I hope you're right, she said. I hope you kids get to experience what normal feels like. But here's the thing about normal. It's not what I expected. Normal doesn't mean forgetting what happened to us or pretending our past doesn't exist. Normal means being able to talk about our experiences without fear, being able to form relationships without constantly worrying about putting people in danger, being able to make plans for the future. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever feel completely safe, if the hypervigilance will ever fade, if the automatic threat assessment we do when entering any new space will ever become unnecessary, if the fear will ever fully leave our eyes when we hear unexpected knocks or see unfamiliar cars parked on our street. But then Wesley takes my hand during a movie, or Ethan makes one of his terrible dad jokes, or Mom hangs another one of her students' drawings on our refrigerator, and I remember that some rules are worth breaking, even when the cost seems impossibly high. The rule about not answering the door after dark kept us alive for 16 years, but ultimately it was breaking that rule, choosing to fight instead of hide, that finally set us free. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary, especially then.